By December 2025, two neighboring West African states had stopped talking entirely, and their shared border was turning into a lawless corridor. When Côte d'Ivoire finally broke the silence, it wasn't to reconcile. It was to prevent total collapse. Because in the new West Africa, trust is gone, alliances are fractured, and the question isn't whether nations can cooperate, it's whether they can survive each other. On December 22, 2025, two of West Africa's most strategically positioned states are no longer just politically opposed. They are operating under completely incompatible security doctrines. And that shift is now threatening the stability of the entire region. Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso aren't at war, but they've reached something arguably more dangerous, a total breakdown in how they define security, sovereignty, and survival itself. This isn't about a border skirmish or a diplomatic insult. This is about two governments that can no longer speak the same strategic language. Abidjan, under President Alassane Ouattara, remains locked into the old playbook: coordination with ECOWAS, continuity with France and Western security partners, reliance on multilateral frameworks that have existed for decades. It's a system built on predictability, even when that predictability means slow progress and compromised sovereignty. For Côte d'Ivoire, stability comes from working within the system, not tearing it apart. But Ouagadougou has chosen the opposite path. Since Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power in September 2022, Burkina Faso has embraced what can only be described as radical strategic autonomy. Traoré didn't just overthrow a government. He declared an entirely new security doctrine. French forces were expelled. ECOWAS protocols were ignored. And in their place, Burkina Faso aligned itself with Russia, partnered with Mali and Niger in the alliance of Sahel states, and made it clear that sovereignty would not be negotiated, diluted, or compromised for the sake of regional harmony. For Traoré, security doesn't come from coordination, it comes from control, from rejecting external influence, from prioritizing military autonomy over diplomatic consensus. And this is where the real fracture emerges. Because Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso share more than just rhetoric. They share a border, intelligence networks, migration flows, and economic dependencies. Under normal circumstances, neighboring states can disagree politically and still cooperate on security. But when one state views multilateral institutions as essential and the other views them as tools of foreign control, cooperation becomes structurally impossible. You can't coordinate counterterrorism operations when one side trusts ECOWAS intelligence and the other considers it compromised by Western interests. You can't manage cross-border threats when one government sees French military presence as stabilizing and the other sees it as neo-colonial occupation. By late 2025, this wasn't just a policy disagreement. It had become a security liability. Côte d'Ivoire watched nervously as Burkina Faso pivoted toward Moscow, hosting Russian military instructors and downplaying jihadist expansion in favor of confronting internal dissent and alleged foreign interference. Ouagadougou, meanwhile, viewed Abidjan's continued cooperation with France as evidence that Côte d'Ivoire remained trapped in a system designed to keep African states dependent. Trust didn't just erode, it evaporated. Intelligence sharing slowed. Joint border patrols stalled. Even routine diplomatic engagements became tense, performative exercises rather than genuine coordination. What made this clash particularly dangerous was its timing. The Sahel was already destabilizing. Jihadist networks were expanding. Coups had spread across the region. And ECOWAS itself was fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. Suspended member states forming alternative alliances, threatening to withdraw entirely. In this context, the divergence between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso wasn't just bilateral. It was symptomatic of a broader regional realignment. One where states were being forced to choose sides not based on shared interests, but on fundamentally opposed visions of what security even means. Is this a temporary rift, or the beginning of a permanent fracture in West African geopolitics? Because if Abidjan and Ouagadougou can't find common ground, it raises a more urgent question. Can ECOWAS survive when its most critical members no longer operate under the same strategic assumptions? And if the answer is no, what replaces it? Right now, West Africa isn't just dealing with insurgencies and coups. It's dealing with the collapse of the consensus that held the region together for decades. And the fallout from that collapse is only just beginning. By mid-2025, the border between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso had become something far more dangerous than a political dividing line. It had become a security vacuum. And in West Africa, vacuums don't stay empty for long. This is a 584-kilometer stretch of territory that once functioned as a controlled, cooperatively managed frontier. Joint patrols were routine. Intelligence flowed both ways. Cross-border threats were identified early and neutralized through coordinated response. But when trust between Abidjan and Ouagadougou collapsed, so did the infrastructure that kept that border functional. Intelligence sharing was suspended. Joint operations ceased entirely. What replaced cooperation wasn't neutrality, it was absence. And armed groups noticed immediately. The mechanics of this breakdown are critical to understand. Because borders don't secure themselves. They require constant communication, shared surveillance, synchronized deployment, and most importantly, mutual trust that both sides are committed to the same outcome. When Burkina Faso pivoted toward strategic autonomy and rejected multilateral frameworks, Côte d'Ivoire found itself unable to coordinate even basic security operations. You can't run joint patrols when your partner views your intelligence sources as compromised. You can't share real-time threat assessments when one government suspects the other of serving foreign interests. And you certainly can't maintain a secure frontier when both sides have stopped talking altogether. So the border began to transform, slowly at first, then with alarming speed. Armed groups, jihadist networks, smuggling syndicates, militias operating in the gray space between ideology and profit, started moving more freely. They exploited the disengagement, recognizing that neither Ivorian nor Burkinabè forces were positioned to respond effectively without risking escalation or misunderstanding with the other side. The border didn't just become porous, it became a corridor. And that corridor ran directly south, toward Côte d'Ivoire's northern regions and, beyond them, the coast. This is where the stakes become undeniable. Because Burkina Faso's security crisis was never contained within its own borders. The Sahel doesn't work that way. Instability flows. It follows trade routes, migration paths, and the natural geographic pull toward more prosperous, less militarized regions. For years, Côte d'Ivoire had managed to insulate itself from the worst of the Sahel's jihadist expansion, in part because it maintained working relationships with its northern neighbors. But isolation as a security strategy only works if you can fully control your own perimeter. And when a 584-kilometer border becomes ungoverned, isolation becomes exposure. Armed groups didn't need to launch large-scale invasions. They simply moved incrementally, testing response times, probing for weaknesses, establishing logistics networks in areas where neither government was effectively present. Small villages near the border became transit points. Remote areas that once saw occasional patrols now saw none. And because Abidjan and Ouagadougou were no longer coordinating, neither side had a complete picture of what was happening in the buffer zone that separated them. The intelligence gap became an operational blind spot, and operational blind spots in counterinsurgency are lethal. By December 2025, Côte d'Ivoire was facing a reality it had long tried to avoid. Instability was no longer something happening in the Sahel. It was creeping steadily toward the coast. And the mechanism driving that expansion wasn't just jihadist ideology or regional conflict. It was the structural failure of two neighboring states to maintain even minimal security cooperation in a region where threats don't respect borders or political disagreements. What happens next could redefine not just Ivorian security, but the entire Sahel coastal dynamic. Because if the buffer zone has already collapsed, the question isn't whether instability will reach the coast, it's how far it will go, and whether any regional framework still exists to stop it. Côte d'Ivoire bet on continuity and multilateral coordination. Burkina Faso bet on autonomy and rupture. And the border between them is now proving that in West Africa's current security environment, neither strategy works in isolation. The cost of that realization is being paid in real time in ungoverned territory that's becoming more dangerous with every passing month. By December 2025, Côte d'Ivoire made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. It reached out to Burkina Faso, not to reconcile, not to rebuild trust, but to prevent something far worse than political tension: total systemic collapse. This wasn't diplomacy in the traditional sense. It was damage control. Because by late 2025, both Abidjan and Ouagadougou had arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Disengagement wasn't reducing risk, it was multiplying it. The border had become ungoverned. Armed groups were exploiting the vacuum. Trade corridors that connected landlocked Burkina Faso to Ivorian ports were under strain. Refugee flows were increasing. And the longer both governments maintained their strategic silence, the more likely it became that a miscalculation, a border incident, a misidentified threat, an uncoordinated military operation would spiral into something neither side could contain. So Côte d'Ivoire blinked first, not out of weakness, but out of strategic necessity. The outreach was quiet, deliberate, and carefully framed not as an attempt to restore the old relationship, but as an acknowledgement that a new framework was needed. Because the old regional order, the one built on ECOWAS coordination, multilateral security frameworks, and the assumption that West African states would eventually converge on shared principles, was gone. It had been eroding for years, but by 2025, it was undeniable. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had formed the alliance of Sahel states. ECOWAS was fracturing, and states across the region were being forced to choose between ideological alignment and pragmatic survival. Abidjan's calculation was straightforward. If Burkina Faso couldn't be brought back into the fold, it at least needed to be prevented from becoming an unmanageable threat. That meant establishing some form of transactional coexistence, limited communication on border security, minimal coordination on cross-border threats, enough engagement to prevent miscalculation, but not enough to require political alignment. This wasn't reconciliation. It was containment. And it represented a fundamental shift in how Côte d'Ivoire was thinking about regional stability. For years, Abidjan had operated under the assumption that continuity and multilateral engagement would eventually stabilize the region. That assumption was now dead. What replaced it was something colder, more pragmatic, and far less optimistic. The recognition that stability in West Africa's new reality wouldn't come from shared values or institutional cooperation, but from disciplined management of divergent interests. States that fundamentally disagreed on security doctrine, foreign alignment, and governance philosophy would need to find ways to coexist without collapsing into open hostility. Not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. Burkina Faso's response to this outreach remains unclear, but the very fact that Abidjan initiated it signals how seriously Côte d'Ivoire was taking the risk of continued silence. Because silence wasn't neutral. Silence was creating space for armed groups to move freely. Silence was allowing misunderstandings to harden into assumptions. Silence was turning a political disagreement into a security crisis that neither government could afford to ignore. This is where the stakes become regional. Because if Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, two states with deep economic, cultural, and logistical interdependencies, can't even maintain minimal functional communication, what does that mean for the rest of West Africa? What does it mean for ECOWAS? What does it mean for states that are watching this breakdown and calculating their own next moves? The December outreach wasn't a solution. It was an admission that the old frameworks have failed and that something else, something more transactional, more limited, more fragile, needs to take their place. Côte d'Ivoire isn't trying to rebuild the relationship. It's trying to prevent it from becoming a catastrophe. And in West Africa's current environment, that might be the most realistic objective available. What happens next will determine whether managed coexistence is even possible in a region where trust has evaporated and political divergence has hardened into structural opposition. Because if disciplined, transactional engagement can prevent miscalculation and contain instability, it might offer a model for how other fractured relationships in the region can be managed. But if it fails, if even minimal coordination proves impossible, then West Africa isn't just dealing with the collapse of ECOWAS. It's dealing with the collapse of any shared framework for preventing conflict between neighboring states. And the cost of that collapse won't be measured in diplomatic statements. It will be measured in borders that can't be secured, threats that can't be contained, and a region that's running out of mechanisms to stop itself from fracturing completely. In mid-2025, a Burkinabè activist died in Ivorian custody, and what should have been a contained diplomatic incident instead became proof that the relationship between Abidjan and Ouagadougou had already broken beyond repair. This wasn't the event that caused the crisis. It was the event that exposed how deep the fracture had become. Because when trust exists between neighboring states, incidents like this are managed quietly, investigated, contextualized, resolved through back channels before they become public flashpoints. But by the time this death occurred, there were no back channels left, no trusted intermediaries, no shared mechanisms to contain escalation. The diplomatic infrastructure that once allowed these governments to de-escalate had been hollowed out by years of silence, suspicion, and fundamentally incompatible security doctrines. So instead of being managed, the incident exploded. In Ouagadougou, it was immediately framed as evidence of Ivorian hostility toward Burkinabè nationals, part of a broader pattern of disrespect for sovereignty and complicity with foreign agendas. State media and pro-government voices seized on it, not just as a tragedy, but as confirmation of everything they already believed about Côte d'Ivoire's alignment with Western interests and rejection of Sahelian solidarity. For Burkina Faso's government, this wasn't just about one activist. It was symbolic of a larger betrayal. Abidjan, meanwhile, found itself in an impossible position. Any investigation, no matter how transparent, would be viewed with suspicion by a government that had already decided Côte d'Ivoire couldn't be trusted. Any explanation would be dismissed as cover-up. Any attempt at dialogue would be interpreted as deflection. And because the bilateral relationship had already deteriorated to the point where even routine communication had become strained, there was no mechanism to present facts in a way that Ouagadougou would accept as credible. The incident didn't create distrust, it inherited it. And this is where the real danger became visible. Because what this incident revealed wasn't just poor communication or political tension. It revealed that the entire system of bilateral cooperation had ceased to function. There were no shock absorbers left, no diplomatic buffers, no shared institutional frameworks that could absorb even a minor crisis without it spiraling into a full-blown escalation. The relationship had become so brittle that a single event, one that in previous years might have been resolved quietly, now threatened to formalize a breakdown that had been building for months. For years, Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso had maintained at least the appearance of functional diplomacy, even as their security philosophies diverged. But by mid-2025, that appearance had become unsustainable. The activist death didn't force either government to change course. It simply confirmed that both sides had already chosen their positions. Ouagadougou had decided that Abidjan represented continuity with systems it now rejected. Abidjan had decided that Ouagadougou's new direction was too unpredictable, too aligned with actors Côte d'Ivoire viewed as destabilizing, to allow for meaningful partnership. And once those decisions were made, every subsequent event was interpreted through that lens. What made this particularly dangerous was the regional context. West Africa in 2025 wasn't a stable environment where two neighbors could afford to stop talking. Jihadist networks were expanding. Coups had destabilized multiple governments. ECOWAS was fracturing. And the border between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso was already becoming a security vacuum. In that environment, losing the ability to manage even minor incidents wasn't just a diplomatic failure. It was a strategic vulnerability. Because if a single death could spiral into a crisis, what happens when a more serious security incident occurs? What happens when armed groups operate across the border and neither government can coordinate a response? The activist's death didn't cause the breakdown, but it proved that the breakdown was already complete. And in West Africa's current security environment, that might be the most dangerous revelation of all. Because once you lose the ability to manage crises between neighboring states, you don't get it back easily. And the cost of that loss isn't measured in diplomatic statements. It's measured in instability, miscalculation, and the slow erosion of any remaining regional cohesion. The question now isn't whether this relationship can be salvaged. It's whether the mechanisms that once prevented these situations from escalating even exist anymore.